Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. Curious Mind, Brilliant Life, the story of Richard Feynman. Chapter 1. A Curious Boy in Far Rockaway. Richard Feynman was born on May 11, 1918, in the neighborhood of Far Rockaway in Queens, New York City. His parents, Melville and Lucille Feynman, were both first-generation Americans. Melville, his father, worked as a sales manager in the uniform business. Though he did not have much formal education, Melville had a passion for knowledge and a strong belief in thinking clearly and independently. He shared these values with his children, especially with his son Richard. From a young age, Richard showed signs of being deeply curious. He was the kind of child who wanted to know how everything worked. He asked questions constantly, not just to get answers, but to truly understand. If something didn't make sense, he would not rest until he had figured it out. This habit of intense curiosity became a defining part of his personality. Melville often took young Richard on long walks and used these moments as teaching opportunities. He would point at trees, birds, or the stars and ask Richard questions like, "What makes the leaves green?" or "How do birds know where to fly in the winter?" He didn't simply give his son facts. Instead, he encouraged Richard to observe, think, and explain things in his own words. Lucille, Richard's mother, had a different but equally important influence. She was lively, funny, and full of energy. She taught Richard the importance of humor and imagination. In a house full of laughter and learning, young Richard thrived. His mother would often tell stories or make jokes to lighten the mood. This balance of curiosity and joy became part of who Richard was, serious about thinking, but never too serious to laugh. As Richard grew older, his interest in science became stronger. He built a small laboratory in his home's basement where he would conduct experiments using wires, batteries, magnets, and bits of metal. He would test ideas and build small devices. One of his favorite activities was fixing radios, which was still a relatively new technology at the time. Whenever someone in the neighborhood had a broken radio, they would often call young Richard to take a look. He didn't just guess when something was wrong. He listened carefully to the sounds, thought deeply about the problem, and tried logical solutions. One day, while repairing a radio that made strange noises, he amazed the owner by explaining what might be wrong based on the sound patterns. His ability to think like a machine gave him a local reputation as a boy with special talent. In school, Richard was not always seen as a model student. He didn't care much for rules or memorizing things just for tests. Instead, he wanted to understand the real meaning behind ideas. He enjoyed math especially. By the time he was in middle school, he had already taught himself algebra, trigonometry, and even some calculus. He would create his own methods to solve problems, not always following the textbook. This creative approach to learning sometimes confused his teachers, but it gave him a deeper understanding of the subjects. At Far Rockaway High School, Richard's talents became even more obvious. He joined the math team and started winning competitions. He also began exploring physics more seriously. For him, physics was not just a subject, it was a way to explain the universe. It combined math with reality, logic with nature. He once said that physics allowed him to feel the beauty of the world in motion. During these years, Richard's younger sister Joan became one of his closest companions. He encouraged her to take an interest in science, even though it was unusual for girls at the time. Their shared love of learning brought them closer. Richard believed that everyone, regardless of gender, should have the chance to explore ideas and follow their curiosity. Money was often tight in the Feynman household, but education was a top priority. Melville and Lucille were determined to give Richard every opportunity they could afford. They bought him books, let him explore with tools and electronics, and gave him freedom to learn in his own way. Their support was not just financial, it was emotional and intellectual. By the time Richard was ready for college, he was already thinking at a high level. He applied to several schools, but one stood out: the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, better known as MIT. It was a place where science and innovation were at the center of learning. Getting accepted to MIT was a big step, not just academically, but also as a sign that the curious boy from far Rockaway was on his way to something greater. Richard later said that his early years were the most important in shaping who he became. The habits of thinking, questioning, and laughing that he developed as a child stayed with him for life. He didn't just learn facts, he learned how to learn, which is something far more powerful. Looking back, it's clear that his childhood was a perfect foundation for the extraordinary life that followed. His parents' belief in independent thinking, his love of problem-solving, and his playful spirit all combined to create a unique and powerful mind. In the chapters ahead, we will follow Richard as he moves from student to scientist, from wartime physicist to Nobel Prize winner, and from teacher to global thinker. But at the heart of it all, he remained the same boy who once took apart radios and asked his father, why? That spirit, the spirit of curiosity, never left him. Chapter 2. The Young Fixer and Problem Solver. As Richard Feynman moved through his teenage years, his passion for problem solving only grew stronger. He became known not just for asking good questions, but for figuring out how to fix things, especially things that others couldn't. Radios, broken lamps, alarm clocks, and other household gadgets all became opportunities for learning. His neighborhood in Far Rockaway knew him as the kid who could fix anything. If someone had a device that made strange noises or simply stopped working, they would call Richard. He never studied from manuals. Instead, he learned by doing. He would open up the machine, study its parts, and think deeply about how everything worked together. He said he could see the problem just by imagining the system in his mind. But Richard didn't stop at repairing machines. He also loved solving puzzles and brain teasers. If he came across a math problem or a logic question that was considered too difficult, he would sit for hours until he understood it. His ability to focus was intense. He could lose himself in a problem, working through many possible answers before finding the right one. At Far Rockaway High School, Richard's skill in mathematics put him far ahead of his classmates. He began studying topics usually taught in college, like calculus and advanced algebra. One of his favorite things to do was to create his own problems and then solve them. He often challenged himself in this way, believing that true understanding comes from struggle, not just reading. Richard also developed a unique approach to thinking. He didn't just memorize rules or formulas. Instead, he tried to understand why they worked. This habit led him to invent his own methods. For example, while studying trigonometry, he created a system of his own that helped him remember the relationships between angles and sides without using the standard names. His teachers were sometimes confused by this, but they couldn't deny that his answers were correct and often more elegant than the official methods. This early ability to simplify complex ideas became one of his greatest strengths. Later in life, it would help him become one of the best physics teachers of all time. But even as a teenager, he showed signs of this special talent. Outside of school, Richard spent much of his time reading science books and experimenting. He built small electric motors and practiced using tools like soldering irons and wires. He also began to understand chemistry by creating simple reactions using materials he could find at home. He treated his basement like a private lab. One of his most important discoveries during this time was that learning is more exciting when you do it for yourself. Richard believed that copying others was not as valuable as discovering ideas on your own. He once said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." This idea stayed with him throughout his life. In his free time, he also enjoyed playing games with his younger sister Joan. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and fun. Richard didn't think science was only for boys. He encouraged Joan to explore, to ask questions, and to be brave in her thinking. This was unusual in the 1930s, when girls were often told science wasn't for them. But Richard believed that intelligence and curiosity had no gender. During these years, Richard also showed signs of being a natural teacher. When his classmates didn't understand a topic, he would explain it in his own words. He used examples, pictures, and even jokes to make things clearer. He enjoyed helping others learn, and he was good at it. He once helped a classmate understand algebra by comparing it to something completely different, like fixing a car. By connecting new knowledge to things people already knew, Richard made learning feel easier and more enjoyable. This method would become a key part of his teaching style in the future. Despite his talent, Richard was not arrogant. He didn't show off or try to make others feel small. In fact, he believed that the best kind of knowledge is the kind you can explain simply. If you can't explain it to someone else, he thought, then maybe you don't understand it well enough yourself. By the time he was a senior in high school, Richard had won several math competitions and was known throughout the school as the math whiz. He was confident, but not proud in a negative way. He saw math and science as tools for discovery, not as ways to feel superior. He also started thinking about his future. What kind of life did he want? He knew he wanted to keep learning, to solve deeper and more interesting problems, and to be around other people who loved ideas. College seemed like the natural next step. He wanted to go to a place where curiosity was valued and where he could challenge himself even more. Richard applied to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, one of the top science schools in the country. It was not easy to get in, especially for someone from a modest background, but his strong academic record, deep thinking, and creative problem-solving made him stand out. When he was accepted, it felt like a dream come true. He was excited not only for the education, but also for the opportunity to be surrounded by other bright minds. At MIT, he would have access to top professors, advanced labs, and a world of ideas. He could finally dive deeper into physics, a subject that had captured his heart. Before leaving for college, Richard spent time reflecting on his journey so far. He knew he had been lucky to have parents who encouraged thinking, lucky to have found joy in solving problems, and lucky to discover early on what made him feel alive. He also knew that he had worked hard, stayed curious, and followed his own path. These qualities, more than luck, would guide him through the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. As he packed his bags and prepared to leave far Rockaway, Richard was filled with excitement and hope. He was ready to enter a bigger world, one full of complex questions, scientific challenges, and endless possibilities. The fixer of radios was now becoming a seeker of truth. And while the world of science would soon become his playground, he would never forget the basement experiments, the puzzles solved at the kitchen table, or the joy of figuring something out for the very first time. Chapter 3: College Years and Finding His Path. Richard Feynman arrived at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology MIT in 1935 with great excitement and high expectations. He was just 17 years old, full of energy, and ready to begin his life as a serious scientist. MIT was a place buzzing with ideas, where some of the world's best minds came together to study, research, and invent. For someone like Richard, curious, independent, and eager to learn, it was the perfect environment. At first, the transition to college life was challenging. The academic workload was intense, and students were expected to manage their own time. Many of Richard's classmates had come from top schools and had been trained in formal ways of thinking. Richard, with his creative and self-taught approach, sometimes felt different, but this difference soon became his strength. He quickly discovered that while others memorized formulas, he understood the reasons behind them. He didn't just know equations, he felt them. This gave him a deep advantage in solving difficult problems, especially in physics and mathematics. He could approach problems from different angles using logic, imagination, and experimentation. When others got stuck, Richard often found new paths forward. At MIT, Richard began to explore more advanced areas of science. He studied mechanics, electricity, and magnetism, thermodynamics, and quantum theory, the strange and mysterious science of the very small. Quantum theory was still a young field at the time, full of unanswered questions and strange results. For many students, it was confusing and even frightening, but Richard loved it. He once said, "I think I can safely say that nobody understands quantum mechanics," but that didn't stop him from diving into it with joy. In his early college years, Richard considered becoming an engineer. After all, He had always enjoyed building and fixing things. But as he learned more about physics, the science of the fundamental laws of nature, he realized this was his true passion. Physics allowed him to ask big questions. How does the universe work? What are the smallest building blocks of matter? Why do things behave the way they do? He switched his focus to physics and never looked back. Richard's classes at MIT were difficult, but exciting. He had some excellent professors who encouraged deep thinking and creativity. Still, he was not always satisfied with the way subjects were taught. He believed that true understanding came from playing with ideas, not just listening to lectures. He began to build his own notes, filled with explanations in his own words, diagrams, and problem-solving methods. These personal notebooks would later form the foundation of his famous teaching style. One of Richard's favorite things to do was to solve problems in unusual ways. He enjoyed doing calculations in his head, creating shortcuts, and finding elegant solutions. For example, when learning how to compute complex integrals in calculus, he invented new ways of visualizing the problem so that the solution would come more naturally. Sometimes, his professors were surprised by the creativity of his work. But Richard was not only focused on academics, he also made time for fun. He enjoyed playing pranks, joking with friends, and participating in campus activities. He played the drums, read humor magazines, and once even joined a student acting club. His sense of humor never left him, even when he was solving some of the most difficult scientific problems. Feynman's social skills were a bit unusual. He wasn't always interested in small talk or traditional manners, but he loved deep conversations and playful debates. He had a group of close friends who appreciated his sharp mind and honest, sometimes mischievous personality. Richard was not afraid to question authority or challenge common ideas, whether in science or in life. One of the most important experiences during his time at MIT was his undergraduate thesis. Unlike many students who simply followed a professor's research, Richard chose to explore a topic on his own: the forces inside molecules. His goal was to understand how quantum mechanics could explain the stability of molecules. This was a complex topic, but Richard worked through it step by step, using both intuition and mathematics. His thesis was not just good, it was outstanding. In fact, it was so impressive that one professor later said it could have been a PhD thesis. The work showed that Richard was already thinking like a professional physicist. He wasn't just solving known problems, he was creating new knowledge. As graduation approached in 1939, Richard began to think about his future. He knew he wanted to continue studying physics, and he began applying to graduate programs. Several top schools accepted him, but one stood out: Princeton University. Princeton was home to some of the world's most famous scientists, including Albert Einstein and Eugene Wigner. It had a strong reputation in theoretical physics, the exact field that Richard wanted to enter. When he received an offer to join Princeton as a graduate student, he accepted with enthusiasm. Before leaving MIT, Richard took a moment to reflect on his 4 years there. He had grown not only as a student, but also as a thinker, a communicator, and a problem solver. He had found his direction in life and had built the confidence to follow it. His years at MIT taught him an important lesson: that science is not about memorizing facts, but about asking the right questions, playing with ideas, and never being afraid to make mistakes. He learned that being curious was more important than being perfect, and that the best discoveries often come from the simplest questions. As he packed his things and prepared to leave for Princeton, Richard felt ready for whatever came next. He didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. A war was coming, and it would need minds like his. Still, at this moment in time, Richard was just a young man with big ideas, heading into the next chapter of his life, a chapter filled with scientific adventure, new friendships, and world-changing discoveries. He was no longer just a fixer of radios or a solver of math puzzles. He was now a physicist in the making, standing on the edge of greatness. Chapter 4: War, Weapons, and the Manhattan Project. When Richard Feynman began his graduate studies at Princeton University in 1939, the world was on the edge of a major transformation. Across the Atlantic, tensions in Europe were rising. In September of that year, Germany invaded Poland, starting what would become World War II. While war had not yet touched American soil, scientists and political leaders began preparing for the possibility that it soon might. Princeton was a place of quiet study and brilliant minds. Among its faculty were leading physicists and mathematicians, and its campus often felt like a peaceful island of thought. For Feynman, the transition from MIT to Princeton was exciting. He was surrounded by people who, like him, wanted to unlock the secrets of the universe. But he also found Princeton to be a more formal environment. Professors wore suits, and students were expected to be polite and reserved. Richard's down-to-earth style and sense of humor sometimes clashed with these traditions. Still, he earned respect quickly, not by acting like everyone else, but by thinking more clearly than most. His supervisor at Princeton was John Archibald Wheeler, a brilliant and open-minded physicist who had a talent for guiding young scientists. Wheeler immediately saw Feynman's potential and gave him the freedom to explore challenging problems. Their working relationship was productive, respectful, and even playful at times. Under Wheeler's mentorship, Feynman began to explore the complicated world of quantum electrodynamics, QED, the theory that describes how light and matter interact. QED was full of paradoxes and strange results. At the time, no one had a completely consistent explanation for it. Feynman's ability to visualize problems and develop new mathematical tools would later revolutionize this area, but during his early days at Princeton, he was still learning the basics. Despite the challenging coursework and deep research, the shadow of war was growing. In 1941, the United States officially entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Everything changed. Science and technology became tools of national survival, and physicists were suddenly asked to help build new kinds of weapons. One of the most secretive and important projects of this time was the Manhattan Project, a top-secret effort by the US government to build an atomic bomb before Nazi Germany could. The fear was that if Hitler developed the bomb first, it could bring unimaginable destruction to the world. Scientists across the country were quietly recruited to join the effort. Many, including Feynman's mentors, felt it was their duty to help, not because they wanted to build bombs, but because they feared the consequences of inaction. When Richard was invited to join the project, he was still completing his PhD at Princeton. Though he was passionate about pure science, he also felt a sense of responsibility. He agreed to help. In 1942, he completed his doctoral thesis, which explored the quantum behavior of systems interacting with their surroundings. It was a difficult and highly technical paper, but it showed his deep understanding of the rules of quantum mechanics. With his degree in hand, he now turned his full attention to the war. Feynman was sent to Los Alamos, New Mexico, the heart of the Manhattan Project. This remote desert town was chosen to keep the project hidden from public view. A new laboratory had been built there under the leadership of J. Robert Oppenheimer, a brilliant physicist and charismatic leader. Los Alamos was unlike any place Richard had ever seen. It was both a military base and a scientific research center. Barbed wire fences, armed guards, and strict security surrounded the facility. Everyone had identification badges. Conversations were limited, and secrecy was enforced with extreme seriousness. Scientists had to use code names for materials and never spoke openly about what they were doing. Yet behind these security walls, some of the most brilliant minds in the world were working together on the same goal: to build a weapon that could end the war. Feynman, still in his early 20s, was one of the youngest group leaders at Los Alamos. He was assigned to work on theoretical physics problems related to nuclear reactions. His job was to calculate how neutrons would behave during a nuclear explosion, how they would move, collide, and cause further reactions. These calculations were essential for designing a bomb that would actually work. He worked closely with other scientists, including Hans Bethe, who became both a mentor and friend. Beatty admired Feynman's unusual way of thinking and his quick grasp of complex ideas. Richard, in turn, respected Beatty's experience and leadership. Together, they made critical progress. One of Feynman's greatest strengths was his ability to simplify problems. He didn't get lost in complicated equations. Instead, he would ask, what is really happening here? He would draw pictures, use analogies, and break problems into smaller parts. This practical, hands-on thinking helped the team move faster and avoid mistakes. Feynman also introduced creative ideas about how to improve the project's efficiency. For example, he suggested faster methods for checking calculations, helped fix design flaws in early bomb models, and even found ways to organize data more clearly. In one case, he discovered that a key computer punch card system was miscalculating data due to operator error, a small problem that could have had serious consequences. His attention to detail and curiosity saved time and improved safety. Outside of work, Feynman's curiosity continued. He learned to crack safes just for fun, not to steal secrets, but to show how poor the lab's security systems really were. He proved that many scientists were careless with their combination locks and left documents unguarded. Though this alarmed the military officers, it also led to better safety practices. Feynman's wife, Arlene, who was very ill with tuberculosis, stayed in a hospital far away during this time. Their relationship was one of deep love and support, even as she suffered. Richard would write her long letters, filled with affection, and sometimes drawings. He missed her terribly, and visited her whenever possible. Her illness and their shared courage added emotional weight to his time at Los Alamos. In July 1945, after years of intense work, the first atomic bomb was tested in the New Mexico desert. The explosion lit up the sky and created a shockwave that could be felt for miles. The project had succeeded, but at a great moral cost. Feynman watched the explosion from a distance. He felt a mix of awe and fear. The physics had worked, but the human consequences were enormous. Just weeks later, 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, first on Hiroshima, then on Nagasaki. The destruction was beyond anything the world had seen. Like many scientists on the Manhattan Project, Feynman felt both pride and guilt. He had helped end the war, but he also saw the deadly power of what they had built. He began to question whether science should always be used to build more powerful weapons. This experience changed him. Though he continued his scientific career with great success, he became more cautious about how science was used. He wanted future generations of scientists to think carefully about the impact of their work. As the war ended, the Los Alamos lab slowly emptied. Scientists returned to their universities, and the world tried to return to peace. Richard Feynman, now only 27, had played a key role in one of the most significant events in modern history. But his story was just beginning. He would go on to reshape physics, inspire generations of students, and teach the world not just how to understand nature, but how to think. Chapter 5. After the bomb, rebuilding a life and career. The war was over. The atomic bombs had been dropped. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were dead. The Manhattan Project had achieved its goal. But the victory came with an invisible burden, one that weighed heavily on many scientists, including Richard Feynman. At just 27 years old, Feynman had contributed to a global event that changed history. But now, as he left Los Alamos and a tight grip of military secrecy, he was stepping into a world that felt strangely quiet and uncertain. The intense purpose and pressure of the war had kept him focused for years. Without it, he suddenly felt lost. More than anything, Feynman felt the loss of his wife, Arlene. She had died of tuberculosis only weeks before the atomic bombs were dropped. Her passing devastated him. Arlene had been the person he confided in, laughed with, and loved deeply, even as illness weakened her body. Throughout her long struggle, she had been his source of comfort and inspiration. Her death left a hole in his heart that no scientific achievement could fill. After returning to civilian life, Feynman accepted a temporary position at Cornell University in upstate New York. The university had been eager to recruit talented physicists after the war, and Feynman, despite his youth, already had a reputation as a rising star. Still, his first years at Cornell were difficult. Emotionally, he was drained. He no longer felt the spark that had once driven him to solve problems and explore new ideas. He attended lectures and gave talks, but he often felt like an outsider, disconnected from the joy of discovery. He later described this time as a kind of scientific depression. He questioned whether he would ever feel inspired again. At the same time, the world of science was changing. The war had shown governments how powerful science could be, and funding for research increased dramatically. Universities received grants to study everything from nuclear physics to electronics. Feynman was surrounded by opportunity, but he struggled to engage with it. And yet, something within him refused to give up. He began to focus on solving problems just for fun, not because they were important or prestigious, but because they were interesting. One day, he stumbled upon a physics problem involving a spinning plate tossed into the air in a cafeteria. As he watched the plate wobble and rotate, he wondered if he could describe its motion using mathematics. The problem was simple, but it caught his attention. He began working on it late at night, filling pages with equations. It was pointless, he told himself, but it was also playful. And slowly, to his surprise, he found himself smiling again. The joy of science, of playing with ideas, was returning. That spinning plate became a turning point. It reminded Feynman of what he loved about physics: the freedom to wonder, to explore, and to understand how the universe worked, no matter how small or strange the question might be. As his curiosity came back to life, so did his creativity. He returned to his earlier interest in quantum electrodynamics, QED, one of the most complex and incomplete areas of modern physics. QED tried to explain how light and matter interact at the quantum level, an essential part of understanding the universe, yet full of contradictions and unsolved puzzles. Feynman's unique way of thinking gave him an advantage. He didn't rely solely on heavy mathematics. Instead, he visualized processes, tiny particles moving and interacting, almost like characters in a play. He began developing a new way of representing these interactions, using simple diagrams to show how particles exchanged energy and momentum. These would later become known as Feynman diagrams, a revolutionary tool that made complex calculations more intuitive and visual. They allowed physicists to see what was happening inside atomic and subatomic systems. What had once required pages of equations could now be understood with a few well-drawn lines and arrows. Feynman diagrams not only helped clarify QED, they helped bring a new generation of physicists into the field. They are still taught in physics classrooms today, a testament to his creative genius. As his scientific life revived, so did his personal life. Feynman was still a young man, full of energy and mischief. He started dating again, traveled to places he had never seen, and explored new hobbies. He took up drumming, practiced drawing, and even spent time learning Portuguese so he could visit Brazil and experience a different culture. His teaching style also began to develop during this period. Feynman had a gift for explaining difficult ideas in clear, everyday language. He believed that if you couldn't explain something simply, you didn't really understand it. His lectures at Cornell became famous for their energy and clarity. Students were drawn to his passion and honesty. In 1948, Feynman presented his work on QED at a major scientific conference. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Other physicists saw the power of his approach and recognized that it offered a new path forward. Among those impressed was Freeman Dyson, a young theorist who helped translate Feynman's ideas into more formal mathematics, making them more widely accepted. By the early 1950s, Feynman had re-established himself as one of the leading physicists in the world. He had survived personal loss, scientific doubt, and the moral weight of war. Through it all, he had stayed true to his spirit, curious, bold, and unwilling to accept easy answers. This was also the time when he received an invitation that would shape the rest of his career. The California Institute of Technology, better known as Caltech, offered him a permanent position as a professor. Located in Pasadena, California, Caltech was known for its excellence in science and its informal, open atmosphere. It was the perfect fit for Feynman's personality. He accepted. At Caltech, Feynman found a home: the sunny weather, the free-spirited culture, and the top-level research environment allowed him to flourish. He continued his work on quantum physics, expanded into new areas like particle theory and computing, and began developing a legendary reputation as a teacher. But more than that, Caltech gave Feynman space to think, to teach, and to be himself. He was no longer just a wartime physicist or a young genius. He was becoming something more, a guide, a mentor, and a symbol of what science could be when driven by curiosity and joy. He often said, the pleasure of finding things out was what drove him, and now, after a period of grief and uncertainty, he was once again discovering that pleasure both in the world of physics and in the unpredictable, beautiful adventure of life. Chapter 6: Feynman Diagrams and the New Language of Physics. By the time Richard Feynman arrived at the California Institute of Technology Caltech in the early 1950s, he had already made a name for himself in the world of theoretical physics. However, his most enduring contribution was still unfolding, a visual and conceptual revolution in how scientists understood the interaction of particles. The field of quantum electrodynamics, or QED, had long been a thorn in the side of theoretical physicists. It sought to explain how light and matter interact, how electrons and photons, the carriers of electromagnetic force, behave at the quantum level. The challenge was enormous. Calculations often gave infinite, nonsensical answers, and the equations involved were almost impossibly complex. Feynman approached the problem from a radically different angle. Rather than wrestling with mountains of algebra, he imagined particles as actors in a kind of cosmic play. What mattered wasn't just the final result of a reaction, but all the possible paths a particle might take between 2 points. This idea that particles could explore all paths, each with a certain probability, became central to his approach. He built on this insight by introducing what would come to be known as Feynman diagrams, simple, visual tools that mapped out interactions between particles in a way that was both intuitive and mathematically powerful. Each diagram was like a story told with lines and points. A straight line represented an electron or positron. A wavy line symbolized a photon, a particle of light. The point where lines met, called vertices, marked events where particles interacted, for example, an electron emitting or absorbing a photon. What made these diagrams revolutionary was not just their simplicity, but their usefulness. They allowed physicists to break down complex interactions into manageable parts. Each diagram corresponded to a specific mathematical expression, making calculations far easier and more accurate. Feynman diagrams gave scientists a common visual language. No longer did they have to rely on endless equations to explain a particle collision. They could draw a picture. And that picture would not only tell a story, but also produce real, testable predictions about the universe. This transformation was more than cosmetic. It changed the culture of physics. Young physicists quickly embraced Feynman's method. It allowed them to visualize difficult concepts, share ideas more clearly, and tackle previously impossible problems. It also gave them confidence. If they could draw the diagram, they could understand the process. Feynman's approach did more than help with QED. Over time, physicists applied the same diagrammatic methods to other fundamental forces, the strong and weak nuclear interactions, and eventually to the development of the standard model of particle physics. Feynman had given science a universal toolkit, one that would shape research for generations to come. But despite the enormous impact of his work, Feynman remained suspicious of fame. He disliked the idea of becoming a great man of science and preferred to be seen as a curious explorer. When the scientific community began celebrating his work with prizes and awards, he accepted them politely, but never sought them out. In 1965, the recognition became impossible to ignore. That year, Feynman shared the Nobel Prize in Physics with 2 other physicists, Julian Schwinger and Shinichiro Tominaga. Each had contributed to solving the problems of QED, but Feynman's methods had proven especially accessible and transformative. The Nobel Committee praised their work for bringing a new degree of accuracy to physics and for solving difficulties that had been regarded as insurmountable. When the announcement was made, reporters rushed to interview Feynman. His reaction was typical. He shrugged, smiled, and said, "I've already got the prize, the pleasure of finding things out." He flew to Sweden to receive the award, dressed modestly and behaving casually among royals and scientists alike. During the ceremonies, he spoke more about teaching than fame, more about discovery than personal achievement. He wanted people to understand that science was not a pedestal, but a playground, open to anyone curious enough to explore. Feynman's teaching philosophy reflected this spirit. At Caltech, he became legendary for his ability to explain complex topics in plain English, using analogies and humor to bring ideas to life. His lectures drew large crowds, and students described him as both brilliant and refreshingly honest. In the early 1960s, he was asked to deliver a new series of lectures for undergraduate students at Caltech. What began as a few talks turned into a full course that covered everything from classical mechanics to electromagnetism, thermodynamics, and quantum theory. These talks were recorded and later published as the Feynman Lectures on Physics. The 3-volume set became one of the most celebrated physics books in the world. It was not a beginner's guide. The content was deep and sophisticated, but Feynman's voice, wit, and clarity made it accessible to anyone willing to follow the journey. For many aspiring scientists, it became a kind of Bible, a guide not just to the laws of nature, but to the joy of learning itself. Outside the classroom, Feynman remained restless and curious. He took up bongo drumming and performed with musicians. He visited Brazil, where he taught physics and fell in love with samba music. He dabbled in art and began drawing portraits, signing them with a playful pseudonym, Fay. He also became involved in computing and early developments in nanotechnology. Long before it became fashionable, he predicted the future of building things on an atomic scale. In an infamous 1959 lecture titled, "There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom," he challenged scientists to imagine manipulating individual atoms, an idea that helped spark the field of nanoscience. But even as his fame grew, Feynman resisted the image of the genius. He often said that he was not smarter than others, just more persistent. He believed that confusion was a natural part of learning, and that asking dumb questions was often the smartest thing a person could do. He encouraged students to think for themselves, to experiment, to doubt, even to question their teachers. Science, for Feynman, was not about memorizing facts. It was about being open to the unknown and finding joy in the process of discovery. One of his most quoted lines captures this spirit perfectly. "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." As the 1960s progressed, Feynman became not just a great physicist, but a cultural figure, a rare scientist who was both a master of his field and a master communicator. He showed the world that science could be human, funny, and full of wonder. Yet for all his fame, he remained deeply grounded. He continued to teach, to laugh, to explore. His mind stayed busy, his heart light. Whether he was solving the secrets of the universe or fixing a broken radio, Richard Feynman remained, at his core, a curious boy, forever playing with ideas, forever asking, "What happens if I try this?" Chapter 7: The Challenger Disaster and the Courage to Speak the Truth. In January 1986, Richard Feynman was enjoying retirement. He was still active at Caltech, occasionally lecturing, writing, and staying involved in science, but he had pulled back from the intense demands of research. He spent time drawing, playing the bongos, and traveling with his second wife, Gwyneth. Life was comfortable until a disaster pulled him back into the public spotlight. On the morning of January 28, 1986, millions of people watched on live television as the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida. Among the 7 crew members was Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher who was to be the first civilian to fly in space. Excitement was high, but just 73 seconds after launch, the shuttle exploded in mid-air. The tragic accident stunned the world. All 7 astronauts died. The explosion raised immediate questions. What went wrong? Could it have been prevented? Was NASA hiding something? To find answers, President Ronald Reagan formed a commission to investigate the disaster. Officially known as the Rogers Commission, it was made up of experts, government officials, astronauts, and, surprisingly, Richard Feynman. Feynman was not an aerospace engineer nor a space expert, but his reputation as a brilliant and independent thinker made him the perfect outsider to ask difficult questions. He agreed to join, but with a condition. He wanted to speak freely and follow the truth wherever it led. From the beginning, Feynman sensed something was wrong, not just with the shuttle, but with the system behind it. At the commission meetings, he listened politely, but in private, he visited engineers, technicians, and managers at NASA and its contractors. He spoke directly to the people building and testing the shuttle. He asked simple but powerful questions. What happens when it's cold? Do the materials always work the same way? Are managers listening to engineers? Again and again, one issue came up. O-rings. O-rings were rubber seals used in the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Their job was to prevent hot gases from escaping during liftoff. But several engineers warned that, in cold weather, the O-rings could become stiff and fail to seal properly. The temperature on the morning of the launch had been much lower than normal, around freezing. Feynman suspected that this detail was crucial. He ran a simple experiment during a televised session of the commission. Holding up a sample of O-ring material with a pair of pliers, he dipped it into a glass of ice water. After a few minutes, he squeezed it, and it didn't bounce back. The rubber had lost its flexibility. The message was clear. The cold had made the O-rings brittle, and brittle O-rings can fail. This small but powerful demonstration shocked the public and embarrassed NASA. Feynman had turned a complex technical issue into a simple, undeniable truth. He wasn't trying to be dramatic, he was just being honest. But the deeper issue was not the O-rings themselves. It was the culture at NASA. Feynman discovered that engineers had warned about the O-rings for years, especially under cold temperatures. But management had ignored or misunderstood these warnings. There was pressure to stick to launch schedules, avoid delays, and present a picture of safety and confidence. Bad news was buried. Risks were downplayed. Communication between engineers and executives was broken. Feynman saw this as a moral failure as well as a technical one. For a successful technology, he wrote, reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. This line would become one of the most quoted statements of his career. The official Rogers Commission report was being written, and Feynman feared it was too soft. He didn't want to blame individuals, but he did want the truth made clear. When he learned that parts of the report might downplay the role of organizational failure, he insisted on including his own personal appendix. In it, he described how NASA managers claimed there was only a 1 in 100,000 chance of shuttle failure, an absurdly low number, considering the dangers involved. Engineers, by contrast, estimated a 1 in 100 chance, far riskier. This gap between image and reality, between wishful thinking and honest science, deeply troubled Feynman. His appendix ended with a sober warning for a successful technology. Reality must take precedence over public relations, for nature cannot be fooled. The final report, published in June 1986, included Feynman's appendix in full. His words were impossible to ignore. They sparked wide debate about NASA's safety culture, eventually leading to reforms in the space program. Feynman had once again shown his courage, not just intellectual, but moral. He had asked the uncomfortable questions, spoken the difficult truths, and stood up for scientific integrity. After the report, Feynman returned to Caltech, exhausted but satisfied that he had done what he could. He didn't enjoy government commissions or politics, but he knew that, this time, his voice had mattered. The Challenger investigation marked one of the last major public acts of Feynman's life. His health was declining. Cancer that had first appeared in the 1970s was returning. He would fight it for several more years, undergoing surgeries and treatments. But he continued to work, write, and inspire others. In many ways, the Challenger episode was a perfect expression of who Richard Feynman was. a scientist who demanded truth, a teacher who could make the complex simple, a citizen who used his mind and voice to protect others. A human being who believed that understanding the world was not just a privilege, but a responsibility. Feynman's honesty didn't always make him popular, but it made him trusted. People listened to him not because he was famous, but because he spoke plainly, asked the right questions, and wasn't afraid to challenge authority. To Feynman, science was not about prestige or power. It was about curiosity, clarity, and courage. As he once put it, "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." Through the smoke of tragedy, Feynman had once again lit a path toward truth, not just for scientists, but for everyone. Chapter 8. Curiosity Without Limits. Feynman's Final Years and Legacy. As Richard Feynman entered the final years of his life, he remained true to the values that had shaped him from childhood: curiosity, honesty, and a joyful approach to learning. Even as his body weakened from recurring illness, his mind stayed sharp and active. To those around him, he remained a man driven not by fame, awards, or money, but by a simple question: what makes the world work? In the late 1980s, Feynman continued teaching at Caltech, though at a slower pace. He chose his activities carefully, focusing on projects that excited him. He gave occasional lectures and spent time mentoring students, especially those who showed the same wild curiosity he had. He was not the kind of professor who kept his distance. Feynman's office door was often open, and his conversations with students were energetic and full of laughter. His students recall how he made science feel alive. He used stories, metaphors, and visual thinking to explain difficult concepts. He would draw on napkins, tap rhythms on the table with his fingers, or use animated hand gestures to show the shape of a path or the spin of a particle. Learning from him was like listening to music, complex, expressive, and full of rhythm. Despite his worsening health, Feynman didn't stop exploring new areas. One of his interests during this period was the development of quantum computing, a revolutionary idea at the time. Along with other physicists and computer scientists, he explored the idea that information could be processed in quantum systems, using the strange behaviors of particles to perform calculations that classical computers could not. He was among the first to suggest that, in order to simulate the behavior of quantum particles correctly, only a quantum computer could do the job. Today, that early insight is seen as foundational in the field of quantum computing. But Feynman was not interested in technology just for its usefulness. He was more interested in the deeper understanding that came with studying the structure of information, reality, and nature itself. He also spent more time writing and reflecting. One of his most popular books, What Do You Care What Other People Think?, was published in 1988. Like his earlier memoir, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. The new book was filled with personal stories, humor, and deep insights into how he thought. It included an emotional chapter about his first wife, Arlene, who had died so young. It also gave an insider's view of his role in the Challenger disaster investigation. The book's title came from a question Arlene had once asked him, a question that remained a guiding light throughout his life. She admired how he followed his own path, even if others didn't understand. He didn't chase popularity or obey rules blindly. His freedom of thought came from his indifference to public opinion. He believed in thinking for oneself. As he said many times, "I have a limited intelligence, and I use it in the service of curiosity." During this time, Feynman's health problems grew more serious. He had suffered from cancer for years, including 2 operations to remove tumors. In the late 1980s, the disease returned, affecting his kidneys and abdomen. He endured multiple surgeries and treatments, often facing complications. Friends and family noted that he faced illness the same way he faced problems in physics, with calm, focus, and interest in the details. Even in the hospital, he remained curious. Nurses would find him questioning the workings of machines or asking about the chemistry of his medicines. He joked with doctors, made them laugh, and tried to lighten the mood in difficult moments. But in early 1988, he learned that his condition had become terminal. Doctors gave him the choice of another risky operation, one that might extend his life or might not. After thinking carefully, Feynman chose not to go through with it. He was tired, and he felt that life, though incredibly precious, should not be extended at any cost, he is reported to have said. "I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring." On February 15th, 1988, Richard Feynman passed away at the age of 69 in Los Angeles. The world lost a scientist, a teacher, a performer, and a philosopher, someone who had made science more human, more exciting, and more accessible. But his influence didn't die with him. Feynman's legacy lives on in many forms. In the Feynman Lectures on Physics, which remain among the most widely read and loved physics books ever written, their clear explanations, deep insights, and elegant language continue to teach new generations. In the field of quantum electrodynamics, where his diagrams and methods revolutionized the way physicists visualize particle interactions. In the spirit of scientific honesty, which he modeled by openly admitting what he didn't know and urging others to seek truth rather than comfort. In education, where his techniques of storytelling, analogies, and simplification remain powerful tools. And in the growing world of popular science, where his playful, personal voice helped redefine what a scientist could be, not just a genius, but a person filled with wonder. Feynman also left behind an attitude, a style, a philosophy of learning. He showed that you didn't need to be stiff or formal to be serious. You could be playful and passionate. You could dance, draw, drum, and still think deeply about the laws of nature. He encouraged people to ask questions, even if they sounded dumb. He believed that not knowing something was not shameful. It was the beginning of exploration. In his view, the best kind of knowledge was not the kind that made you feel superior, but the kind that made you more curious. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. To this day, young scientists carry Feynman's name with admiration. His words appear on posters, notebooks, and lecture slides. His voice echoes in videos and animations that explain everything from atoms to the universe. But perhaps the greatest part of his legacy is the joy of discovery. For Feynman, science was never just a career. It was a form of love, a love for puzzles, for nature, for the unknown. He once described science as the pleasure of finding things out. And through his books, lectures, and life story, Richard Feynman gave that pleasure to millions. Chapter 9. The Feynman Technique: Learning, Teaching, and Thinking Clearly. Richard Feynman wasn't just a brilliant physicist, he was a brilliant learner. His ability to understand, remember, and explain complex ideas set him apart not only as a scientist, but also as one of the most effective teachers of the 20th century. Central to his approach was something now known as the Feynman technique, a simple but powerful method for deep understanding. Learning starts with not knowing. Feynman believed that the first step in learning was honesty. You had to admit what you didn't know. Many people pretend to understand things just to feel smart, but Feynman warned against this. He called it self-deception, and he believed it was the biggest obstacle to real knowledge. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So instead of hiding confusion, Feynman welcomed it. If something didn't make sense, he asked questions. If no one had the answer, he searched for it himself. He wasn't afraid to look ignorant. He only cared about finding truth. The power of simplicity. Feynman often said, if you can't explain something in simple terms, you don't really understand it. This belief shaped his learning style. When he studied a topic, he didn't try to memorize definitions or repeat what textbooks said. Instead, he tried to find a clear and simple explanation, one that even a child could understand. That's the heart of the Feynman technique. Here's how it works, in 4 basic steps. Step 1. Choose a concept and write it down. Pick something you want to understand, maybe the law of gravity or quantum tunneling. Write the topic at the top of a blank page. Step 2. Teach it like you're explaining it to a child. Now, explain the idea in your own words. Pretend you're teaching it to someone who knows nothing about it, a child, a friend, or even yourself a year ago. Avoid technical jargon. Use simple words and clear examples. Step 3. Identify what you don't understand. As you try to explain, you'll quickly find the gaps in your knowledge. Maybe there's a part that doesn't make sense. Maybe you're using a word you can't define. Go back to your sources, relearn the parts you're missing, and refine your explanation. Step 4. Simplify and use analogies. Once you can explain the idea clearly, make it even simpler. Use metaphors or stories to make abstract ideas more concrete. Feynman often used everyday examples: spinning plates, bouncing balls, or ants walking along a trail. Feynman in the classroom. Feynman's teaching style at Caltech reflected these principles. He didn't just lecture, he performed. His blackboard work was clear and elegant. He used colorful language, jokes, and real-world images. Students said that even the most difficult concepts seemed natural when Feynman explained them. One of his best-known teaching projects was the Feynman Lectures on Physics, a series of lectures given in the early 1960s. They were meant for freshman students, but covered everything from classical mechanics to quantum physics. The lectures were later turned into a 3-volume book that is still widely read today. What made these lectures different was not just their content, but their style. Feynman didn't just present formulas, he explored why they mattered. He dug into the beauty and mystery behind equations, helping students see the elegance of physics. He also made it okay to not know. He encouraged students to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to play with ideas. In a world where many professors expected silence and respect, Feynman wanted curiosity and conversation. Teaching beyond science. Though Feynman was a physicist, his learning philosophy applied to everything, from music and drawing to languages and philosophy. He once taught himself to draw by practicing every day and reading art books. He didn't care if he was good at it. He simply wanted to explore and improve. He also studied languages. While in Brazil, he learned Portuguese so he could lecture to students in their native tongue. He learned bits of Japanese, Russian, and even Latin just for fun. His joy came not from mastery, but from discovery. In this way, Feynman lived the life of a lifelong learner, someone who sees every subject as an open field, every question as a doorway. Why it works. The Feynman technique works because it turns passive learning into active learning. Most people read or listen without testing their own understanding. They recognize the words but don't deeply grasp the meaning. Feynman's method forces you to use your knowledge to organize it, explain it, and find gaps. It turns confusion into curiosity and confusion into clarity. It also builds confidence. Once you've explained something in your own words, you own it. You no longer depend on someone else's version. You're free to build on it, connect it to other ideas, and use it in your own way. This approach is especially powerful for English learners. By using English to explain rather than just repeat, learners build deeper fluency and stronger memory. Vocabulary becomes connected to meaning and experience, not just lists. A legacy of clear thinking. Feynman's approach has influenced not just students, but also writers, educators, entrepreneurs, and scientists around the world. His technique is used in study skills courses, productivity books, and online learning platforms. It's especially popular today in the age of self-learning, where people use YouTube, online courses, and digital libraries to teach themselves anything, from coding to cooking to chemistry. In this world, Feynman's method is more useful than ever. It encourages independence, it rewards simplicity, and it respects the learner's ability to understand anything as long as they are honest, curious, and patient. Teaching as a joyful act. Feynman didn't see teaching as a duty, he saw it as a privilege. He loved helping others discover the beauty of science. He celebrated the moment when a student's face lit up with understanding. To him, teaching was an act of love, for knowledge, for people, and for the universe itself. He once said, "I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong." That attitude, humble, open, and full of wonder, is what made Feynman more than a teacher. He was a guide, showing people how to think, how to question, and how to enjoy the ride. His method wasn't about learning faster, it was about learning better, more deeply, more honestly, and more joyfully. And that's a lesson that goes far beyond physics. Chapter 10. The Eternal Teacher: How Richard Feynman Inspires the World Today. When Richard Feynman passed away in 1988, he left behind no physical monument, no giant laboratory with his name carved in stone. Yet his influence has grown larger with time. In classrooms, online forums, scientific circles, and even personal development seminars, Feynman's spirit lives on. More than a great physicist, he is remembered as the eternal teacher, someone who taught us how to wonder, how to question, and how to think. A life that continues to speak. Feynman's lectures, books, and recorded interviews continue to attract millions of people worldwide. His autobiography, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, remains a bestseller, not because it teaches physics directly, but because it teaches something deeper: the joy of thinking. In this book, readers meet a man who is playful, sharp, curious, and deeply human. From fixing radios as a child, to cracking safes at Los Alamos, to dancing in Brazilian samba clubs, Feynman's life is a collection of stories that are equal parts comedy, adventure, and education. His storytelling made people feel that science wasn't locked away in textbooks, it was all around them. For English learners, these stories offer more than inspiration. They offer natural, vivid, and real language, full of idioms, personality, and emotional depth. They bring English to life. A new kind of role model. Unlike the quiet, distant geniuses often imagined in science, Feynman was open, enthusiastic, and sometimes rebellious. He didn't fit the mold of a proper scientist. He joked with students, challenged institutions, and painted pictures in bars. He was serious about his work, but never took himself too seriously. This made him an appealing role model for many. You didn't have to be a perfect student or a math genius to be like Feynman. You just needed curiosity and the courage to follow it. Even today, in an age of fast answers and digital overload, Feynman's slow, honest, thoughtful approach feels fresh. His belief in deep understanding, rather than surface knowledge, is more important than ever. Feynman in the digital age. Since the early 2000s, Feynman has become a beloved figure on the internet. His lectures have been digitized and shared freely. Clips from his interviews appear in motivational videos and TED-style talks. Quotes from him are found on Reddit threads, Instagram posts, and educational blogs. Many educators recommend the Feynman technique to students learning science, math, and even foreign languages. Study platforms like Notion, Anki, and Quizlet include guides on how to use his method to remember information. YouTube creators produce entire series on Feynman's ideas, explaining quantum mechanics using simple animations and storytelling. One of the most viewed online resources is The Pleasure of Finding Things Out, a documentary that captures Feynman's philosophy on learning, integrity, and the beauty of nature. In it, Feynman says, "I have a friend who's an artist and has sometimes taken a view which I don't agree with very well. He'll hold up a flower and say, 'Look how beautiful it is,' and I'll agree. But he says, 'You see, as an artist, I can see how beautiful this is. But you, as a scientist, take it all apart and it becomes dull.' I think he's kind of nutty. I can see much more about the flower than he sees. I could imagine the cells in there, the complicated actions inside, which also have a beauty." This quote has become a classic, an argument that science doesn't take away beauty, but adds to it. It's a perfect example of Feynman's ability to connect science with life. His influence on modern thinkers. Feynman's legacy is not limited to scientists. Many modern leaders in technology, education, and innovation name him as a major influence. Elon Musk has referenced Feynman's method of reasoning from first principles, breaking a problem, down to its basic truths and building up from there. Writers like Bill Bryson and James Gleick have explored Feynman's life to understand how genius works. Educational channels such as Veritasium, Minute Physics, and Kurzgesagt often borrow Feynman's style, combining clarity, visuals, and storytelling to teach complex ideas. Even beyond the classroom, professionals in fields like design, business, and software engineering study Feynman's ideas about learning. In a world of specialization and information overload, his message is simple but radical. You don't truly understand something unless you can explain it clearly. Science with integrity. One of the most important lessons Feynman left us was about scientific integrity, the responsibility of being honest, open, and willing to admit what you don't know. In a famous speech titled Cargo Cult Science, he criticized researchers who only followed the forms of science without its deep spirit. He warned that if scientists cared more about results than truth, they would stop doing real science. He encouraged students to ask tough questions, challenge popular ideas, and never hide uncertainty. Science is the belief in the ignorance of experts. This quote, often repeated, reminds us that science is not about having all the answers. It's about constantly searching, doubting, and testing. For learners, especially in the age of artificial intelligence and big data, Feynman's emphasis on integrity is a crucial guide. It reminds us that information is everywhere, but understanding still takes effort, reflection, and honesty. The human side of genius. What makes Feynman unforgettable is not just his brilliance, it's his humanity. He loved jokes. He cried when he lost his first wife. He struggled with depression and doubt. He danced, played drums, and flirted. He wasn't perfect, and he never claimed to be. This made him real. In his books, he shares mistakes. In his lectures, he shares his joy. And in his interviews, he shares his struggles. To many learners, this is encouraging. You don't have to be perfect to be great. You just have to stay curious, ask honest questions, and enjoy the journey. Lessons for the future. So what can we, as lifelong students, take from Feynman's life? Curiosity is the engine of learning. Ask why. Explore widely. Stay hungry for knowledge. Simplicity is a sign of mastery. Don't hide behind big words. Try to say things clearly and simply. Teaching is a tool for thinking. If you want to remember something, try explaining it to someone else. Mistakes are part of the process. Don't fear them. Learn from them. Integrity matters. Be honest about what you know and what you don't. Whether you're learning English, studying physics, or trying to understand yourself, these lessons apply. They help us learn more deeply, live more honestly, and think more clearly. The teacher lives on. Though Richard Feynman died more than 3 decades ago, his voice still speaks, his lessons still teach, and his spirit still inspires millions of learners across the world. He once said, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." Today, thousands of students, teachers, and creators follow this idea, building knowledge from the ground up, making sense of the world by teaching it, shaping it, and sharing it. Feynman may be gone, but his method and his joy live on. He was not just a man of science, he was a man of learning, and as long as people keep asking questions, Richard Feynman will never truly disappear. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.